a year, and they tend to do it, say, in late fall. So it grows like crazy in the spring. It sets seed, and then it sits there for the mice to eat it the rest of the summer. It doesn't really grow a lot, and it kind of gets kind of brown. That's like one small step toward these surfaces that heat up. There's not much evaporation going on. There's not much growth. There's not much of...
Not about disturbance or eating or...
There's no cycling. It's stationary.
I want to go back
There's
to
not
Alan's question if we can.
much of this. So, okay. Well, anyway, so how you keep the forest and what state you keep it in is going to affect how much evapotranspiration and also how much carbon sequestration. And anything that increases biodiversity also correlates with, well, one step back. Leaf surfaces, and so leaf height, foliage height diversity, FHD, is a statistic that they measure by clipping or photographing squares vertically. And that's used to measure biodiversity, and biodiversity also, because it correlates so closely, foliage height diversity correlates with biodiversity very closely. So, and it's easier to measure than biodiversity is. And then those two things also correlate with carbon sequestration. And then now that we're looking at these moisture cycles, they also correlate with that. But I don't have as much literature on that because that's a newer thing to look at. Okay, go ahead.
Well,
Thank you for your patience.
No, it's fine. I wanted to add also one thing to what you're saying about managed forests, being more vibrantly healthy. And one piece that's critical.
Yes and no, because there's other things that also cycle.
Right.
Porcupines do it.
Right. That's what I was going to mention, was that it's not that forests have been waiting for humans to come along and, thank God we're here. It's that there were all these other animals that filled that role. Like the big one around here would have been mastodons. Mastodons were in this part of the world for a lot longer than we've been here, and the forests did have time over millions of years to co-evolve with them, and they made clearings. That was what mastodons did. Most elephant-related species predominantly eat trees. They pull trees down and eat them. So you had mastodons going around. They made clearings in the forest. They created more foliage height diversity, but also just habitat diversity. Made niches for all kinds of creatures. Vines are another thing that fills that role. But we have this myth now of the climax forest, that a forest reaches a climax and then you shouldn't touch them because that's how they're supposed to be. But that's a recent phenomenon that we would only be capable of thinking that there was such a thing as a climax forest because all the mastodons are gone, almost certainly killed all by humans during a 300-year period, something like 13,000 years ago.
And because the royalty got the upper hand in Europe and affected our comprehension of history, so that people aren't aware that for 8,000 years people cut all of the greenery off of all the trees every 3 to 8 years for 8,000 years, and then that was stopped so that they could have straight lumber and keep the peasants out of the woods. And then it got so deleted from the history that the signs next to old pollards that are still alive in England don't say it was used for fodder.
So Alan, you were asking about, trees have a big role to play in this, but what about other plants?
Right, that was the question.
Right. So what I would say is that, trees have all these incredible ways in which they're, benefiting all forms of life, but trees can't survive on all parts of this planet. Actually, their range is fairly limited. I think something like a third or less of the Earth's land surface can readily support trees. We can do all kinds of interventions. You can grow trees in Saudi Arabia by, using a ton of energy to desalinate water and water trees. They have they have ski slopes in Dubai, but most of the Earth's surface is much better suited to growing grasses, because grasses can more easily survive in these periods when you have, especially what they call brittle environments. climates are those which have seasonal rainfall and then long droughts in between.
And yet, I mean, I'm surprised, I guess this is new information to me,
Yeah.
and I'm surprised, so I was at a place, in France at a pollard conference that I spoke at, and there were people there from Morocco, which is quite brittle,
Mhm.
and their sheep culture was very focused on trees. They had a limited number of trees, and they coddled them like crazy to have regeneration. They put rocks around to protect little trees, and they take trees that would be kind of bushy with multiple trunks, and they wind them together when they're young to make these pollards so that they're up out of the sheep, because otherwise the sheep have nothing to eat when the grass goes brown. And so there's a whole part of the year when those sheep are completely dependent on these few trees.
Right.
And I had the impression that most brittle places that there are trees that can grow, and that there maybe even used to be more trees there, and some bushy plants.
Right.
But that there has to be the people winding them together and getting them out of the grazing animals, and then being those intermediaries, feeding it down to the animals, otherwise the animals
Right.
do it in the dry season.
Right.
And humans
A
have
lot
had
of
that
those
role.
places where the coddling of trees is definitely, in my judgment, a worthwhile activity. I mean, not to digress on that too much. I mean, the alternative in a lot of those places, like to having the tree fodder for the times when the grasses are brown, would be haymaking. But it seems this is something I'm still interested in learning more about. That haymaking, this is like, okay, you've got great grass growth part of the year, and then part of the year the grass isn't growing.
I'm not sure they ever have great grass growth there.
Well, maybe even just for a short window in whatever is like their spring.
Right.
If the grass grows, there's a period where it's growing better than the rest of the time. And in northerly climates, people developed this strategy of making hay to save for those lean times. That's not something that ever developed really in the warmer parts of the globe.
I think one of the issues is, okay, so here's another concept that I was reading about a few years ago. There's extensive agriculture. Everyone hears about intensive agriculture. Intensive agriculture got really popular at the Industrial Revolution, when the governments all over Europe anyway, which is kind of where we hear our history from, but I'm sure other places, started encouraging people in various policy kinds of ways to focus on their tillable ground. And they started having horse-drawn equipment so they cut the trees and the bushes out of the fields, and they let go of all the other parts of places that they were farming up the mountain slopes or away from the fjords. In Norway, they would have like all these little farmsteads that were stone, and they would have 3 or 4 different ones for different seasons, and then come back, and all that got let go of, and now they're just focused on this little part that was tillable, because all the governments wanted kind of commodity crops that they could tax that would get, they wanted commerce. And before, people were more sustaining villages. And so was I going to say, I don't know.
We've lost some of the extensive practices.
So the extensive was, but what I was going to say is, so in these really brittle places, their agriculture is very, very extensive, because, say, the grass is so thin that you get so little when you cut this whole room. And say you're covering a 50-mile radius wandering around with your herd of sheep, it might be that...
The grass is only that thin more recently. Because even in brittle environments, people have shown that when
you concentrate the
when animals move across the landscape in the way that they do with predator pressure, then you can have really lush growth even in very brittle environments. Because when it gets really thin, it's actually this effect of shading from standing dead grass.
So do you think it had to do with not having the cutting tools? Because, for instance, in the Neolithic, people couldn't cut grass. They could only cut trees.
Right.
Because they had stone axes and they couldn't make long blades to cut grass.
It had more to do probably with killing off predators and us human beings not understanding the importance of how those predators were
bunching the animals.
influencing animal behavior, and then we weren't sufficiently mimicking that. That's what this whole regenerative grazing movement is about, is using as an example how do wild herds under pressure from predators naturally move across a landscape. They move in super dense bunches, and they, thoroughly graze, trample, manure an area, and then they move on and they don't come back for a while. And as people have started to understand the importance of all those functions, we've been able to develop grazing practices that really, increase the health of the soils and the plants, rather than grazing practices that are slowly depleting the health of the land that we're grazing.
Right,
So-
okay, so that's the brittle environments.
Would they do it that way then?
Yes.
In other words, do it dense?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, so probably the godfather of the regenerative grazing movement is this fellow named
Voisin.
Alan Savory. Well, or Voisin.
Voisin's before him.
Yeah, he took the work of this Frenchman, André Voisin, who was the first to realize that overgrazing is not a product of the number of animals on a piece of ground. It's a product of how long they're on a piece of ground. And that actually the best grazing effects are achieved by the highest densities moving the fastest.
So it
And
sounds,
then long enough
Yeah.
rest.
Right.
so it sounds like then, there's a difference between, let's say you're just having fields of grasses versus trees. Well, trees are gonna win in terms of evapotranspiration and for rain and everything else. But if you had the grasses and you had the herbs, would that start equalizing these in any way?
Well, we still probably.
As in compared to how much goodness the trees are.
Yeah, so you have an area, you have trees, you have an area for grass, then you graze it and you do whatever, and then you let it develop or whatever, so
Right.
I don't know, is
That
there
was
something?
back to my question, like what is the most effective way at this point to reverse climate change
Right.
through either, how we use the land?
Yeah, so potentially the answer is actually both, and that's what we call savanna, right? Is that's an ecosystem, we tend to think of, there's this, I used to think that a savanna was this picture I had from National Geographic of certain land areas in Africa that are actually savannas that are moving more towards grassland. The real definition of a savanna is you've got actually quite a few trees, but not in such density that they're shading out the understory. So a savanna has the highest foliage height diversity of any ecosystem. And it also has the highest mass of animal life in it. Not, mammal, at the very least mammal life. Tropical rainforests might have more total living biology in them, but there's at the very least more mammals living in savannas, and possibly more total biomass of animals totally. So which is indicative of the fact that the answer is not, we need forests, or we need grasslands. We need both, and we need them integrated. And actually, that's how all of the living things are going to thrive. And we need tropical rainforests too, where they grow well. And we need grasslands without trees, where that's what grows well. But as far as what we want to be cultivating, which, as I understand, is largely like, I think that the solution is really first, we want to be stewarding wild lands to the best of our ability, but a lot of that also means not doing certain things. But it's our agricultural lands where we're doing a lot, and that's where we're oftentimes doing some of the most harm. Yeah, and so using the savanna as a model for how to conduct our agriculture, well, that would, because we inherently want our agriculture to support animal life, because we're animals, right? And we live on other animals.
And besides,
in
the
many
plants
ways.
do need some carbon dioxide to breathe.
Yeah, so
We breathe in and out as one kind of being with the plants, right?
yeah. So I don't know, is that kind of answering your question a little bit?
And I'd like to, go ahead.
Yeah, there are so many big questions and
'Cause
complication
I have
to it.
more
And
to add too.
yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, but somebody else
Okay.
should ask a question. I'm all set.
So, a lot of people are looking at agriculture and thinking, well, Savannah is a good model. So I was at this conference, I had the honor of being a speaker and getting fed and flown there and stuff last winter, and they had people from 10 countries. And so for 3 whole days, I got to watch all these presentations about all these traditional forms of agriculture all over Europe and Morocco. And everywhere there were traditions of having, in these folks' memories and what they were coming, rows of trees, but I'm sure earlier it was just not even rows, in every kind of field. Like every crop field had rows of trees in it, every hay field had rows of trees in it, every pasture had rows of trees in it. The grapes were held up by poles or wires or just the branches between pollarded trees. There was silk production in Italy that was all pollarded mulberry trees, and they were in the fields, in the crop fields, and in the hay fields, and in the pastures. And it wasn't until they got wider and wider equipment that they cut down these, and they're not all cut down. There's still a lot of these rows of trees still there, but a lot of them did get cut out, and there were government programs to do that, and still are. And then if you go back later, further back, you get stuff like, I brought it last year, but a farming manual from 1756, Browner in Sweden, scanned in on Amazon for $20 with the pages folded that have the pictures, unfortunately. And he's telling people you have to divide your woodland into 3 parts and prune each part 1 year. So you're doing a 3-year cycle, and divide all your tenants as lands too, because they're going to need their tree hay too for their animals for the winter, because everybody was storing leaves for their animals. Until 1900, there was more tree leaves stored for animals than grass hay. Grass hay was only
In
just
what
coming
country?
in all over Europe as a whole.
I would like to see some documentation of that.
Okay,
I
well,
don't know.
I'm quoting Hakan Slot and Mashotchek in Austria and Ingvild Austad in Norway. Not that there
Right.
wasn't grass hay,
Right.
but 50% was still leaves as far as in 1900. And in Sweden in 1756, he said that we have scythes, but people are still mostly cutting with sickles because people don't have the money for scythes in 1756. That's what he said in that book. Yvonne at Black Locust Farm was translating the Swedish with me. But what I wanted to say is I have a few pictures where people are pollarding what looks kind of halfway between a forest and an orchard, because the trees are pretty thick and there's not a lot of grass under them. So it's not really a savanna, but they were doing whole woodlands as well.
Could you address something? I keep hearing these wonderful things on the radio, like we can't have animals anywhere because they take up all the water and then they have methane and da-da-da.
Oh, they say that about
So-
trees too.
Okay, but so can you balance this out then with this kind of agroforestry or whatever you want to call it, or having animals out there, and can that balance out so that it makes the environment better, but also you can end up with animals?
Right, so there's some major assumptions that are false behind what people are saying about, because we actually have fewer grazing ruminants on the planet now. We have more cows, we have fewer grazing ruminants than we've had in a long time, right? So you can't account for increases in greenhouse gases by pointing to, oh, there's too many of these grazing animals, right? Because, yeah, there's more cows, but there's way less bison, right? And so if people are telling us that, because I've actually seen it somewhere claimed that, feedlot cattle emit less methane. Feedlot cattle are better for the environment than grazing cattle. I mean, people can come up with all kinds of numbers, pulled out of,
People who
you know,
eat beans fart a lot more than people who.
I think,
I mean,
let's
come
face
on.
the statistic
Well, if
about
you
it.
got this year's beans and you get them at the
Yeah.
grocery store, they're 8 years old.
I think bean farts smell twice as bad. That's a
And
statistic.
lentils, up
Yeah.
there, up there.
Yeah,
Greenhouse effect is 10 times as strong from green.
yeah, there you
green
go.
parts.
But I mean, this is like, I think how some of these numbers are come up with. I mean, people come up with numbers that say that, oh, lamb is the worst food for the climate, and, you know, it, like, you know, they'll say how much, but, you know, some of, like, one particular statistic I looked at that was saying, oh, we all need to eat more lettuce, because that's, you know, that takes less, you know, but water and fossil fuels, like 1 pound of lettuce takes so much less than 1 pound of lamb. Well, if I give you 1 pound of lamb, and I give her 1 pound of lettuce, she's going to try to steal some of your lamb, because you can't live on 1 pound of lettuce.
Pigs
1
won't
pound
eat
of lettuce
it.
is like nothing, you know? So it's, if you actually make that comparison in terms of units that mean something, like calories, or, you know, or if you even start looking at like, you know, levels of all kinds of vitamins and other nutrients, those calculations go out the window. People just can doctor statistics however they want, right? But so to get back to your question, I haven't been doing this research directly myself, but what I have seen is that we have fewer grazing animals than we used to. So how could grazing animals possibly be responsible for causing increased greenhouse gas levels, right? Because their numbers haven't gone up, but we're blaming them, the methane that they emit and the water that they drink for these problems.
Well, you're focusing on who to blame what for what reasons,
Right.
but what I'm thinking of is like how successful it can be with animals. I mean,
Yeah.
putting, you know, filling up miles and miles of areas with animals right next to each other is obviously not healthy and obviously terrible.
And you
And
also
it-
have to
and
think
it
of where's
is-
their food being grown and what's happening on that
Yeah,
land.
I
So
mean,
it's-
you can
that's
go
part
through
of
the whole
picture.
thing. So it's not the idea of let's do away with animals, but
Right.
let's treat it in a totally different way. And I think
So I've got a statistic for you right here that I just want to make sure I get the units right.
Gotta go.
But
Do you feel like
As
do you
far
want
as
to do the
how much
film?
carbon
probably
can
don't,
be
'cause I mainly
sequestered
Okay.
per acre with beneficial grazing practices.
I gotta go.
Because
Do you want
even
to
though,
film?
you know, part of what we're saying here
that's
is,
what I'm asking.
yeah,
You up for that?
carbon
Yeah.
isn't a problem, but it is a symptom. And one of the big solutions to the problem is still sequestering carbon, because by sequestering carbon in the soil, that's how we're, you know, building up the hydrological cycle, right? So the statistic that I have here is that through, you know, okay, leading innovative farmers confirm that they can biosequester up to 10 tons of carbon per hectare per year in many soils and regions. So that's mostly through a combination of, you know, like agroforestry and regenerative grazing practices. So to give you a sense of what that is, like 10 tons per acre, we've got, I think the amount that we're emitting is, on a planetary scale, is something like 8 billion tons per year in fossil fuel emissions, right? And so if we can sequester 10 tons per acre, that pretty quickly could act, you know, if we were doing that on an extensive enough scale, that could pretty quickly start being comparable to how much we're emitting through our fossil fuel burning. Then there's also just the burning of forests and grasslands and crop fields, which that is actually, again, I have those statistics somewhere here, but that might actually be more total emissions than what we're burning for fuel, right? Just in kind of incidental burning. But the point
And
is,
then there's the effect of then the land surface is doing all those other bad
Right.
things that we talked about,
Right.
and not all the good things that we talked about.
right,
So it's not just the burning itself, but then all those other compounded effects.
yeah. To get more specifics on a lot of this kind of information, you know, I'd be glad to share some resources with you where I've been doing some of this research.
Right.
Walter Jena has the website that's kind of focused on his work is called globalcoolingearth.org,
Right.
I believe.
And so I'm wanting to
Yeah, go ahead.
take a little floor. You want to switch
Yeah.
cameras and you can
Sure.
hold it?
So to bring it kind of from your scientific information kind of back toward my response to your question, is it Maureen?
Yeah.
Of, having animals and whether that's a good thing. And I'm thinking, and you said something about water use, they use water. They're not evapotranspiring themselves, but so when my goats, I'm picturing my goats in all this greenery as you're saying that, and they're munching, and they're making that cycle happen. They're munching, pooping, the plant's eating it, the soil's eating it. There's that, I don't think we said about, so back to that slide, when the plant's making all that sugar, and the animals are eating it, but also the plant's putting down like a third, or maybe it's more, we were both at a talk and I didn't find the notes, but, the plants feed the soil microbes actively. They're not just tithing, it's not just 10% that they're giving them, they're giving them like a third, or some huge amount of that sugar is going to, as root exudates, exuding from the roots, to feed all the life that is part of how the roots get stuff and bring it in from the soil. And so animals being in that picture and eating all that greenery and then being part of that cycle, and when they're eating it, then it causes that regrowth that's rejuvenated. Like the pollards that when I'm cutting for my animals who are then eating, I'm rejuvenating that tree such that the whole top of the tree is now young again, such that there's 1,000-year-old oak trees in England that I saw because they were pollarded, because their tops stayed young all that time. And so, and not only that, but then I was thinking, and when my goats are doing that, they don't even drink water. They don't even drink water because, well, number one, goats are from the Mediterranean areas that all the grass dies and then there's just 8 species of oak, So they're really efficient about water. So anyway, I don't know, that was my thoughts. It's just kind of to bring it back to picturing this greenery as part of the animals. I mean, that's what they're made out of, that's what they're there to do, is to rejuvenate plants and rejuvenate bushes by pruning them. The animals are pruning while I'm pruning higher, and we're traveling in that, timed kind of way, so that I've had goats for 15 years maybe,